Meet Dotty, our newest mannequin. Isn't she wonderful? Today, Dotty is sporting the most beautiful, flowing, elegant, flattering cover-up. Made from 100% linen, guaranteed to keep you cool, even in the hottest weather. Perfect for the beach or even roaming in the garden. Designed by those wonderful people in Italy. Isn't it fabulous? I would love one of these, wouldn't you? If only I could sew. Hello, welcome back, and welcome if you're new. Today I'm going to be taking a pattern from my favourite dress and showing you the highlights of making that, so anything's a little bit complicated. And stick around to the end because there's a nice little extra bit, the walk in the woods. And if you want to skip ahead to any bits, check the description for the timestamps. When you're trying to take a pattern from something that has a piece that's all in one, there's no piecing on this, so like a jacket would have two front pieces, it would have a front and then a front side. This is just all cut out of one piece of fabric. To make it as accurate as possible, I've already folded the sheet in half. What I'm going to do is match up all of the different seams on here and all the different points, and then I'm literally going to draw around it, and I'm using a water soluble marker. I only need it for this bit. What it means is if I accidentally slip and draw on my dress, it'll wash out because I am intending to wear this one again. So the great thing about having pinned this in half is that after I've traced around it and made all of these different markings on here, you can double check. And at the moment what we're doing is the finished size. We'll add in the seam allowances later. I've double checked across here. That's still 3¼ inches, which is the same as what's on the finished garment. And then over here under the arm, I thought I'd made a mistake, and then I remembered whatever I added in here is going to be taken out from the dart, which needs to be extended there, so that will all get pulled back in. So it does need to be a bit of an angle because I've added an inch there, so I need to make sure there's an inch less there, so it will actually be straight by the time that dart's in. So I'm just going to go away and mark this up properly now I've double checked it. Then I'll put on the seam allowance. I'll mark on a ½ inch seam allowance. If you wanted to do a French seam, you probably should allow an inch seam allowance, but the linen that I'm using is quite heavy, so I think it would make it more bulky than anything, so I'm going to finish the seams by hand. do exactly as you did for the front, for the back. Back's much easier. So I've made a mock-up. I did allow, I've got 3/4 of an inch seam allowance. I think I'll leave that on. Means if I ever want to make this out of a sheer fabric, there's plenty to do. Felled seam inside, that kind of thing. I've tried it on. I pinned it, I didn't sew it. It fits fine. I'm really glad it's now an inch longer on the bodice, which is great. Really, really good. It fits so much better. It sits better. I did think it was a bit high under the arm, and then I remembered that, yeah, it's got all of this extra fabric which won't be there. What I'll probably do is bind the arms or make some sort of facing. I haven't decided yet, so I want to give myself, you know, all choices. So whatever I do with the pattern in the future, depending on the fabric, I know I can cut it out and it will be fine. The other thing I haven't made a decision about is the neckline here. On the original dress, it's got, I've forgotten what it's called, it's like a folded piece of fabric used so the fold is at the top, so there's no stitching and there's no raw edges visible. They're all down here, and I haven't decided if I want to do that or not yet. So before I put this to one side, I need to just mark where that would go, because I would actually have to cut this bit and then cut a strip to fold in half. But I don't know if I'm going to do that or not, so at this point it's staying like this. I've done most of the pattern pieces now, and I'll show you them all in a minute. I've done the skirt pieces, so I've done this one, which is cut on the fold, and I've done the outer one, which is cut kind of straight on the grain. It is at the top. It starts out straight on the grain and then it flares all the way out here. Where there is a front and a back with the bodice, I just double checked, because if I can use each of these pattern pieces for each section, it makes my life a lot easier rather than having to make, you know, a centre side piece here for the front and then make another one for the back. But actually I found out that they're all the same measurements, and I just measured a little bit and made sure. So what I did was I measured the top, I measured across the bottom hem part here. So I measured here but in a straight line to check the measurements of top and bottom, and then I did the same thing on the back as well. And then the other thing I did was I measured the length of each piece coming all the way down the centre, and so I was able to establish that actually yes, the front and the back are the same, which is great. So this is the centre front and the centre back, and it's cut like that. There's a little, I've put a little bit more angling on. Where this is linen, it's obviously relaxed quite a lot. It's been worn quite a lot. So what I've tried to do is just identify where the grain of the fabric is and sort of smooth it back into shape when I'm making the pattern pieces. I think it will be okay, as long as you, when you're taking a pattern, if you have a little look at the grain line. This doesn't work for everything. If you're taking a pattern off of a fast fashion item, it might not work. But something that's, you know, a little bit more, should we say, slow fashion. If you check the grain line, it'll give you a good indication of where your pieces should sit. So I've done that piece and I've done the outer piece here. The last bit I've got to do is this one. So I'm sort of calling this the side centre. I don't know what you'd call that. I don't normally make a habit of drawing on my clothes, but just to illustrate the point about the grain line and the importance of it, I'm using my water soluble marker and I'm going to draw a grain line actually on my skirt part of my dress so that you can see it on camera. I could have used tailor's chalk as well, but it's more shocking, isn't it, to draw on your clothes. Let's put this line on. Don't worry, this will come out, probably come out without even washing here, because we have quite high humidity, so these marks disappear quite quickly. So you can see that's the grain line, and see, just pulling on that seam there, you can see it's wobbling. So I need to get that straight again just by smoothing. And that means that when I'm making this pattern piece, I know that this is the line that I need to have in parallel to the grain on here. Now I'm using an old sheet, so rather handily there is a stitched hem on the sheet that I can follow. There's a seam here, so I can follow that line. So literally what I'm going to do is get this bit in parallel with this, and then I know this pattern piece is going to hang properly when it's cut, because it actually there's a little deviation off to one side and there's a big one off to that side. It really comes out sort of diagonally across. So this also means that this is almost a bias. Bias means rather than cut on the straight up and down, you know, like that or across from side to side. It's at an angle through the two. So it means that the fabric's going to stretch. In this dress, that's not going to be a problem because the whole of these sections is gathered into the hem part, and then the hem is all cut straight on the grain. And I'll show you that in the cutting process anyway. I've put my dress on top, and what I've done is I've folded it on the seam line. That's the side seam there. And this is the pattern piece I need to make. Here's the line that we made. I tried to, by eye, make that parallel with this line here, but I'm just going to measure that now. Okay, so it measures 6 inches seam on this sheet. So if I measure here and I line up, and I can see that that's not quite right. So if I gently ease it out until that line is 6 inches away from here, and I just double check everywhere. That is pulling a little bit, and then I'll just do the top part the same. Right, the top part is way off, just goes to show always as well to check. Right, that's pretty good. Because it's so easy to shift around, I'm going to put some pins in and try not to move it at all while you're pinning. And all these, it might seem very exacting, all these measurements and preparations, but if you're going to go to the trouble of, I mean, I love these dresses, these pinafore dresses. They're absolutely brilliant. I really like them. And if you're going to go to the trouble of taking a pattern that you know that you're going to use more than once, even if you're just going to use it twice, it's really worth the time just making sure that it's as good as you can make it. And because once this is done, I know I just have to stitch it together and it's going to fit perfectly how I want it to. It's going to hang beautifully, it's going to drape properly, everything's going to be cut to the right grain line. It really is, I can't stress enough, it really is worth doing this bit. And it's part of the process, because what I'm thinking about, instead of, more measuring and pinning and all that sort of thing, but what I'm thinking about is I can't wait to cut out the fabric and make myself a new dress. I'm not exactly famed for my huge amount of clothes, even though I love, you know, traditional fashions. I particularly love historic costumes and things like that, and historic sewing techniques and all of those sort of things. I don't have many clothes. Right, so that's, I'll probably put the one at the top as well actually. That's all pinned. And now I'm just going to do exactly what I did with all the other pieces, which is I'm going to mark the finished stitch line rather than putting in their seam allowance, which quite frankly is pathetic, especially for linen. That's where the actual waist ends. Do that here as well. And then I think this is actually supposed to be straight, this bit. And while it's all pinned flat, I'm just going to measure the garment. I'm going to measure it at the top, so it's 5 inches. I'm just going to put a little 5 inches there. And then across here, and I'm pushing the tape measure right into the seam line. It's 8 inches. So I'm going to put 8 inches here. Oh, 8's really hard to draw on fabric. And then the last one here. So I'm measuring this straight across here, and that is 10.5 inches. And what that means is when I've made the pattern piece, before I cut it out, I can just do a little quick measure and make sure that the pattern piece matches up with the garment measurements, and it's in the best place to do it. It's while it's all flat. I think that is straightish. Let's have a look. I think it's supposed to be straight. I'm not sure. There's a little bit there. And then very importantly, I need to mark that line to denote the seam line up here. And then this is probably the most difficult part to make accurate, is to mark the waist, where that goes. So I will attempt to do it, but because I've taken that measurement, I know that I can just put the ruler on it afterwards and make sure it's in the right place. To do it as accurate as possible, you put a pin through to the underneath. This is why I use sheets and not paper. And you can pull it back and see where the pin is, which is just here. Let's make sure that that's in the right place. I put the pin in right on the seam, so it's actually that one. I'm just going to do a little arrow on there so I know which one it is. So this is what we're left with. Now I've taken the dress off. These are the marks that I made. So I need to draw in the whole of that line there. Okay, so that's marked out just in the water-soluble marker now. It's less than ½ an inch. I'm gonna leave it, because I did sketch very carefully. So now I'm just going to go and mark it all with a pen, and then I'll be putting on a 3/4 of an inch seam allowance because I still haven't made the decision about how I'm going to finish the seams. But it also means that I think I said this earlier on, it means that I've got lots of options depending on the type of material that I use. So I know that there's a 3/4 of an inch seam allowance if I'm using a chiffon or a wool or something like that. So I'll be back when I finish the last pattern piece. Okay, I know I said I was going to go and mark this before I came back, but I forgot to mention a point, and that is I already had the corresponding pattern pieces for either side. I've just checked out the long side against them, and I had forgotten when I was doing it yesterday. I noticed that it was moving around quite a lot, and I just added about an inch to the bottom anyway. It's really not going to make much difference. I'm quite tall, so I don't mind having it a little bit longer. It's fine. What I did was I checked the piece that fits on here, that's the centre front, and then I checked on here, that's the extreme sort of side piece, and to get them to meet at the waist and then at the hem as well, I've had to extend this by about an inch. So I just thought I'd show you that and say, you know, when you're taking a pattern from anything, if you've already been making pattern pieces, you can always check. This one's quite different because there's an actual hole, there's three or four pieces that make up the hem, and they're shaped as well. So these bits do actually have to meet wherever they're going to meet on the seam line. So what I mean is if you're using a pattern that ends in just turning a hem, you know, on the fabric all the way around, it doesn't matter if they don't meet because you can just neaten it up. You can hang it up somewhere, let it all drop, trim it off so it meets evenly all the way around. But with this, I don't have that luxury, and I already know that because this is cut on the bias, this part is going to droop anyway. So it's as well to just sort of double check. But once it's stitched in, the hem piece is straight on the grain, so it will hold it all in place. Pockets. I can't believe I nearly forgot pockets. I know some people like them, some people don't. I personally love pockets. I think pockets are great. I'm literally just going to sketch around this, vaguely add some seam allowance if I can get it out of this, I hope so. And then I'll need to just cut 4 of these. And then the very last thing I need to do is measure down from the waist to where the pocket is stitched in and mark that on the corresponding pattern piece. Pattern pieces are finished. Here's the centre front, so you can see they fit together. And here's the bodice front and the bodice back, all important pocket. And then the hem bits, which you haven't seen, but because there's so much damage on this dress, I'd actually already unpicked this whole border bit off the bottom of it, so it's quite easy to do the pattern pieces. It's literally made up of 2 of these cut on the fold, one at the centre front and one at the centre back. And then 2 of these are actually shaped, so these have to be cut out not on a fold, they actually have to be cut out like that. And it's slightly higher on the back, so I just need to make sure that either my fabric is folded in half and so I've got, you know, a mirror image of it, and that it's the right way around. We'll worry about that later, and then that will be stitched around. So that's it, I've done the taking the pattern. So stick around if you want to see this transformed into a beautiful linen pinafore from this. just wanted to show you what I've been doing here. So I cut it down 3/4 of an inch, which was the seam allowance, thinking that's where I was going to fold it and then it'd be stitched, but obviously that'd be raw. So what I've done is I've measured actually an inch down, so it's only an extra 1/4 of an inch, so we've got something to stitch into. And I've had a look at the original dress and trying to work out how to do this bit across here. So I know that's a separate flap, and I think that this is done basically as a facing, but a very narrow, like a bias tape or something like that, but the principle's still the same, so everything will be encased inside. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a facing that fits all the way around here and then layer it up with my flap, which I can make just a little bit taller to to counteract the bit that I have had to measure down, and then I will sandwich it all together and I'll try and work out how to do that. And then on the back I'll do a facing as well. Those will both be stitched on before the shoulder seams are stitched up, and then I'll show you how to make that neat around neck area as well. And then it's up to me how much I trim the facing off on the inside. This linen's quite a lot heavier than the original dresses that I've showed you, that I took the pattern from. It might be quite bulky to turn it as a very small edge, but I'll know more once I've got the facing stitched on to get the finished seam here. So there'll only be one line of stitching at the end on the outside. It's just a question of how far I decide to do it. Right, I've tried a couple of things, including layering up the facing with this, I don't even know what you call it. It's sort of like a placket, but not a placket that goes across the neck. I tried that and I tried turning it through, and I couldn't work out for the life of me how to hide the raw edges. So I think the easiest thing to do is what I've done, which is stitch the facing on. I've only tacked it on. I've turned it through. And then I think the best thing for me to do is to measure where this comes from, mark it, and then flip this open and stitch from that mark to the edge on the machine. Do the same on the other side, and then unpick the rest of this, pop this inside, and then try and stitch along the seam. But I've got a line to do it on now because I've ironed it. I've got something to work to. So and then that will actually be between these two bits of fabric there, and that should hide all the raw edges. That's my plan. I'll let you know how it goes. Right, just before I move on to doing the skirt, I'm going to bind the armholes here, and I'm going to use bias binding, which I have here. This is black because the only blue I have is that colour, so I figured the black would show up a lot less than that bright blue. Hopefully if I do it right it won't show at all, but just in case. So to prepare the armhole, first of all I've needed to finish the side seams. So I finished one, so I literally trimmed off one side. This is a flat felled seam, so I've trimmed off one side. I'll show you what the other side looks like. So it looks like that. So I've trimmed off one side really short, about 1/4 of an inch, and then I literally folded the other side over and then stitched it down. And I've done it on the machine. I was going to do it by hand, and I'll probably do all of the skirt by hand. And so for speed, I just did this bit on the machine. This is the second armhole, and to take into consideration how wide the seam allowance is, I measured 1/2 inch down and drew, I don't know if you can see it still, there's a little chalk, no you can't really see that, there's a little chalk line anyway, because I worked out if I unfolded this, pinned it up to the chalk line, then stitched it, that would give me the right seam allowance. So I need to trim this now, but when it's folded under, that's what it looks like. So there's the seam allowance poking through. So on the other side, I've already folded it, trimmed it and pinned it down, and I haven't decided whether I'm going to do this by hand. No, I lied. I'm definitely going to do it by hand because I quite like the no stitching visible around the armholes. I think it looks really nice. I forgot about the shoulder seams, so I just turned it under and pinned it in place while I did this, and then I'll just slip stitch those. And this one on the shoulder seams, I've opened out the seam, and I'm just going to fold in each side so it sits as flat as possible, because if I do it to one side where you've got all this gubbins going on with the facing, it's going to get really bulky. I mean, it's pretty bulky now, so I think that's the neatest way of finishing it. So I'll literally just finish that bit first when I do it, and then I will trim the inside of this and then fold it all down, and that will be stitched on top. So I need to trim this down now and then pin it in place, and then that's as far as I'm going to go with the bodice right now. I'll do all the finishing probably off camera, because you probably don't need to see me doing all that by hand, and I'll go and start working on the skirt. If you remember right back at the beginning when I was doing the pattern for this, I extended the length slightly. So what that's meant is by the time you get to the bottom hem, there's more fabric going around in the hem. And when I cut these, let me show you this bit. This is the end of the hem here. These are the separate pieces that are stitched on. When I cut these, I didn't allow to make them slightly bigger. What you need to do is gather one of these side panels, these two side panels right at the outside on the side seam, gather them down and fit them in. And then I thought I'd just be able to ease, this is the front, I thought I'd be able to ease the rest into that hem. Well, this is what it looks like now I've sorted it out. Don't worry, all these stitches will be taken out. But on the back, what I did was I gathered it down completely, and then there's no gathers at all here, and I held it up and it looked absolutely awful. It looked like a sort of slightly limp plastic bag. So I unpicked it, stitched in some new gather stitches, and then gathered it right across that shaped piece. Much happier with that, and I'm going to go and put the other one right, go and unpick this and just gather it all the way across. Well, it's Monday morning. I've spent all weekend working on this. I'm on the very last bit, which is attaching the bodice to the skirt. I haven't even needed to do any easing stitches. What I did was I pinned together the side seams first. I did take a little bit off there and on the other side, and then I just found the midpoint of the back and the, and then just did it like that, and did the same with the front as well. I divided it all into half and then, matched the two pins and that kind of thing. I looked at the original dress and I had thought that the dart met up with the centre front seam, but it doesn't. It's sort of offset by about an inch, so I just made sure they were the same. I'm literally going to stitch this on the machine. I think what I might do is trim it down on one side. I'd like to hand turn this. If I don't, I'm going to have to put some sort of waist tape on. So this is the finished dress. I'm really pleased with it. There's a few bits of finishing that need to be done, but we ran out of time. We had to go and film all this beautiful woodlandy area, but it just goes to show that if you really like something and you take some good measurements and just really think about the pattern pieces, that you can replicate pretty much anything in your wardrobe. I hope you enjoyed it. Join me again next time. Bye.